This beautiful Victorian home in Los Altos is believed to be one of the oldest in Santa Clara County. It was once the Chandler School for women and later men. It is now a Los Altos landmark and the charming residence of one of our guests this evening. Hello, I'm Nan Geschke, your host for the Los Altos History Show. Tonight we have Susan Oken and Cheryl Witt joining us. Welcome to the History Show, Susan and Cheryl.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Susan and her husband Bob have and her two children have lived in their home on Edgewood Lane since 1991. Susan is a political theory professor at Stanford University, and Cheryl is a local interior designer who became involved with the house when it was completely renovated starting in 1988. Susan, your home is one of the few designated landmarks, residential landmarks in Los Altos, and it is a beautiful home. What about it attracted you first?
Well, we had been looking for a house in the area for the better part of a year, and we had lived in a very old house in the east. We lived in a house that was built in 1869. It had very high ceilings and large windows and a great feeling of space. And when we saw this house, it was just incredibly like that house in those respects. It had such a great feeling of height and the wonderful light that came into it, and it was just about exactly the same period, you know, within 20 years of the house that we lived in the east, and we just fell for it.
So you fell in love. Mm-hmm. Now, the beginning clip that we showed our viewers that before we came up on the set showed the home as a school, a Chandler School. Mm-hmm. What do you know? Do you know anything about the history of that school?
Well, the house was a school from about 1908 till 1912, and it was a school for girls that was started by a woman who had been a Stanford student and then had taught at Mills College. And she started the school for girls. The thing they advertised themselves for in particular was healthy living. And they did a lot of things outside. Apparently the girls slept outside and they took classes outside and they did practically everything outside.
That was kind of the style in those days, I think, you know, this idea of getting a lot of fresh air.
Mm-hmm. I think that was what they were aiming at. But anyway, it didn't succeed as a school because it closed down by 1912, and then it was briefly a school for boys after that. But I think very little is known about the period that it was a boys' school.
Okay. So that was at the beginning of the century, but we actually know that there was a home or some kind of a structure on the property previous to that. Do either one of you know anything about the earliest history of the home?
I think there was a little squatter's cottage on the land in about 1850.
Is that early then?
That early, yeah. It was one of the first structures around in the area.
Yeah, and then I think at least by the 1860s, there was the farmhouse, which was the first real house on the property, and that was a 4-room farmhouse that was built by the 1860s, and it was lived in by a man called Warner Buck, and then he sold it to a family called the Van Reed family, and he actually had hoped to make a lot of money out of the land around it, but then they put what's now El Monte, but was Moody Road. They stuck the road right through the middle of his property, and he basically lost his investment. And then the Van Reeds lived in it for quite a period through, I think, the 70s, until Sarah Winchester bought the house for her sister in 1888.
No, she bought that at the same time she bought the property in San Jose, I believe.
Oh, really?
I believe she moved from the east and invested, instead of gardening and collecting, she decided to do a lot of renovating and building. So Sarah started on her projects almost as soon as she came to California. So anyway, the most famous resident of this house was Sarah Winchester's sister, Isabel Merriman. And she was quite an interesting woman. I mean, we know a lot about Sarah and the fact that she was heir to the Winchester rifle fortune. And it was about $5 million in those days, which was a lot of money. So she had a lot of money to kind of play with. And she obviously bought this piece of property for her sister, but they were very different people. Do you know anything about Isabel?
Well, Sarah was clearly a builder for that part of her life, and she built the much larger front of the house onto the original cottage, and then her sister lived in the whole thing. But her sister was quite a philanthropist.
Yes, a humanitarian. I believe she had a home for abused and abandoned children, illegitimate children, which was quite progressive at that time. And I think she was the first white woman member of NAACP.
I know, that's amazing.
It was really amazing at that time.
Yeah, and the other part of it is that I did read a death notice about her, and she was quite well known in this area, both in Los Altos and in Palo Alto, and probably in the county as being a philanthropist, and also someone who was sort of befriending the downtrodden. And
Yeah,
she continued that work too, I believe.
Yes, it seems as though a lot of people knew her and loved her for what she'd done for lots of people who needed help. Women who were pregnant with illegitimate children, and then the babies themselves. And she continued that work after she moved out of the house in Los Altos, and she moved to Palo Alto, and apparently continued those kind of humane works throughout her life.
And it's kind of, I think it's important to bring out the fact that, you know, exactly when they left, or when Isabel moved to Palo Alto. I think you mentioned,
I think
Cheryl,
around 1907, and
which was following the earthquake.
following the big earthquake, and they had. I know Sarah had a lot of trouble with that earthquake. She was trapped in her bed, and I know there was a lot of damage to that house
In the big Winchester
in the
house.
big Winchester house. So.
I think
that may
also,
have been.
also I know that they did sell the land. It was 100 acres, which sort of enveloped the whole Orange University area and part of the downtown, which is now known as the Downtown Triangle. And it was sold eventually, not initially, but eventually, to Paul Schaup, who developed and brought the railroad into town. And both Sarah and her sister Isabel were not too thrilled.
They fought
about
that railroad
having,
for a couple of years.
They did, and
Yeah.
I know they would go out at night and pull up the surveyor stakes, and so
Must have been very strong women.
very strong.
Yeah.
Which is another point that you made too, Cheryl, when we were talking, the fact that
The house has always had a history of women ownership and strong women, leaders, really.
so Susan, I know, is following in that tradition.
Well, I'm not the sole owner of the house. I own it with my husband, but I would say yes, I think I'm a strong woman. I certainly haven't done all the amazing things that either Sarah or Isabel did in their time, but I'd like to be able to follow in the tradition.
Good. I think you're doing an excellent job. Now, Cheryl, you were involved with this renovation project starting, what, in 1988? How did you get involved?
Well, I knew the owners. They brought me in on the project. I'd done work for them before. And there were two owners, a man and his wife and a contractor. And they bought this house for spec. They wanted to, not to live in the house, but to remodel it and to sell it. So they brought me in, and I worked on it, and it took over a year. It was completed right before the earthquake, so it went on the market in pristine condition a couple of weeks before the earthquake. And of course the earthquake hit, and the house was really solid, but all the old plaster fell, and we walked in, all here was this beautiful house with all the plaster on the floor.
Ah,
It was just,
how disheartening.
yeah, and we were thrilled though that that's all.
Well, what was the condition of the home before renovation? Was it
Well, it really
falling
was.
apart?
It was really a mess. The woman that owned it had 5 children that she had raised herself. She was an attorney, but I think it was all too much for her, and it needed a lot of work. It actually needed systemic work, you know, for earthquake work, and it was really full of junk. This woman, there were junky cars in the yard, and boxes of things piled to the ceiling, and the roof was a mess.
So you were brought in to kind of give it a new look,
Right.
sort of a rehabilitation. So everything was.
Well, we had to bring up the plumbing and all, and
And the
redo
wiring.
all the wiring, and then because we wanted to register it and make it a historic home, we had to do everything according to the guidelines for the historic registry, and you know, we worked with the historical commission, and they oversee everything that you do to make sure that you're doing everything according to the guidelines.
So when you say everything, is that on the exterior
On the
and
exterior,
interior?
they don't actually decide what wall coverings you're going to use or what you're going to do with the flooring or
Yeah, but you were
colors.
careful
but-
to use lots of very appropriate, you know, the freezers and some of the wallpapers
Right,
and
we
things
did
like that.
as much historic work as we could.
Okay. So what kind of research did you do for this project, Cheryl? Did you have a background in Victorian architecture?
Well, no, I have a degree in interior architecture, but I read everything I could on Victorian architecture and interior design and from that period, and went down, of course, to Sarah's house and took that tour and learned a little bit about Sarah, and went to the historical centers and read what I could about the family and
Now-
researched the period.
What did you actually uncover in terms of, you know, architecturally, when you actually started to take the home apart? Were there areas of the home that were obviously original and added on? And
Well, the back of the house was rather plain. It was the farmhouse, and you can see that, obviously. And the front, it was built in the last part of the 19th century, so which was Eastlake style. So it's very ornate, and the transition is quite obvious in certain places.
Inside and outside.
Inside and
right? You
outside.
can tell when you're going from the old house into the 1888 house.
Right, and then there's a window actually inside in the bathroom that is between the hallway and the bathroom that actually was an exterior window at one time. So there are a couple of things like that show obviously where the two houses met.
so what kind of touches did you add to the home that besides the systems upgrades? Were there any rooms that were added?
Well, no, we didn't really change the footprint of the house in any way. The problems and challenges that I had with the owners was they were trying to do things somewhat in an easier way. Possibly, since the gutters were in bad shape, they thought, well, we'll remove the gutters and we'll get new gutters, and we'll make, you know, they'll be in metal and they'll look the same. But then, of course, you know, if you're redoing a historic house, you redo them in the wood that they were originally in. So we ran into those kinds of problems and arguments and situations.
And the Historical Society was pleased that you did real wooden gutters and things like that.
They were very pleased.
Now,
And the colors that the house was painted must have been, you must have researched those.
We
too.
researched that, and I made little models of windows and painted them exactly in 3
interesting.
different schemes, and let them choose, you know, which one they
That's
preferred.
interesting.
so.
Now, Susan, you were not involved in the renovation, we understand, but you live in the home. You know, what does this home that was built starting perhaps in the middle of the 19th century function as a modern home today?
It works wonderfully. I mean, Cheryl did a wonderful job with the kitchen, so that whereas it looks like a country farmhouse kitchen, it's just a wonderful kitchen to cook in. And the whole house works well for us, and we use the backyard, which is big a lot too. And I would say we actually live mostly in the old part of the house, the old farmhouse. I mean, we do some entertaining and things in the newer part, the living room, but except for our bedroom, all the rooms we use most of the time are the original 4 farmhouse rooms.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what would you say would be the advantages of living in a historically designated home, if there are any?
Well, I really love old houses, and one thing I've learned living in California for a number of years is actually you live outside a lot of the time, so the inside of your house isn't that important, but we didn't know that when we moved from the east, so we were really looking for, an inside that we loved. And we'd seen lots of houses in California, and we kept on saying, but where are the high ceilings, and where are the moldings, and where are the big windows? And it was all so different from the house we lived in the east that, this house just seemed like home. And in fact, some of our friends who came to visit us and saw all our furniture that we just brought from the east and just put down in this house, they said, how did you find a house that would just kind of fit your stuff like this? It's amazing.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Cheryl, I wanted to ask you one last question, and that was, what was the biggest challenge that you had in this project? Was it working with the Historical Commission, or was it researching the home, or was it something
Well,
else?
I think because of the 2 owners, and the challenge was actually to get things done the way you wanted to. We had a few arguments over the redwood paneling in one of the earlier rooms.
The family room.
It wasn't. It was old. It's very old. It could possibly have been there since 1860, and it would be easy to take that out and to
paint it or something.
paint
Yeah.
it. And the arguments that I would have, and the challenge was to get the point across that to do as little as possible. I mean, to keep
To really-
the old, to
really preserve
work
it.
with the old.
I know, that's so important, I think, when we have a home that's as important as this Winchester
Well, I
Merriman
think
home.
Cheryl did a wonderful job of that, and we're eternally grateful.
I know. Well, thank you both so much. This
Thank you.
time has gone by so quickly. We want to thank you for sharing a little bit about the history of the Winchester Merriam House. And this past weekend, Susan invited us to join her at her home, and she let us view some of the restored rooms, and we met Cheryl there for the first time, and she was able to share with us a little bit more about some of these rooms. So please stay tuned and see more about the Winchester Merriam House. Let's roll that tape now.
Hello, Nan.
Good morning, Susan. How
So
are
glad you could
today?
come by and see the house.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome.
It's such a beautiful place. I just
Well, thank you.
I've been admiring it from the outside, and it's it's a pretty fall day, and it just really shows up the beautiful architecture of the home outside.
Great.
So,
Well, we feel very honored to be able to live
I
in this
know.
house. It's such
and
a great
these
house.
doors are so magnificent. Are they? Do you think those may be from the early part of the
Well, I think so.
house's history, or?
I think this whole part of the house, this was all added in the 1880s, we think, by Sarah Winchester and her sister, for her sister to live in. And I think a lot of it is pretty much the way it was then, or else it's been restored to being the way it was then. So,
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
yes.
So, if this was an add-on, what was is there an original part of the house, do you think?
Yes, the earlier part of the house was a simple farmhouse, and it's the back of the house. Would you like to go and see that?
Oh, I'd love to.
Great.
Okay, let's go. Now, Susan, you were in the family room of your home, and what you said is maybe the original room of the house?
Yes, well, people think that this might have been the first room that was, the first building that was ever on this property was where this room is now, but this room was definitely part of the farmhouse that was here at least by the 1860s.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yes.
So, is there anything special about this room that's special to you, or?
Well, this room is the only one that has this redwood paneling in it, and as far as I'm concerned, the thing about this room is that it was really, when I walked into this room, that I just really fell for the house. Because,
is that right?
Mm-hmm. The reason is that it reminded me very much of my grandmother, who was one of my favorite people growing up. I had this elderly grandmother who had moved to New Zealand from Denmark, and she lived in a Victorian house, a Victorian cottage in New Zealand. And several features of this room are exactly like her house.
Now, what features would they be?
Well, the windows in her house were just like these long windows here.
These
exactly that
elegant
shape.
windows, just
yes,
beautiful.
but very simple Victorian kind of Victorian villa windows, I guess you'd call them. And then the door, she had doors like this, like with the lead pane glass in it. And so it just took me right back to her house.
That's gorgeous.
And the room has a wonderful kind of enclosed feeling to it, which also made me feel very...
And it's just works so well, you know, with the your African masks, which, you know, one wouldn't necessarily think would belong in this room, but they work so really well.
Well, it is a nice place to display them, yes. My husband has been collecting masks, African ones and Mexican ones, and the original ones we collected are the Venetian ones. But they do look good in this room, don't they?
Very wonderful. Now, Susan, were you and your husband the ones who were responsible for refurbishing this home? I know it was restored several years ago.
No, it was restored about 7 years ago, but actually we were lucky enough to find it when all the work had been done.
Well, lucky you.
So we didn't have to go through that whole process. And actually, I'd like to introduce you to the person who did all the design work and had all the major ideas for doing the restoration. And that's Cheryl Witt here. Cheryl?
Hi, Cheryl.
I'd like you to meet Nan Geschke.
Hi, Nan.
Glad to
Nice to meet you. Glad
Yes.
you could be
Well,
here.
I'm sure that Cheryl will be able to tell you all about the way that they found the house and all the ideas and how they got it to look the way it does today.
Okay, well,
Good.
I'd love to chat with you, and thanks so much, Susan.
You're welcome, Nan.
Okay, Cheryl, now you've been, you were the designer on the project from the beginning. And I know that this was Susan's, or is Susan's favorite room in the house. Do you have a
Yes.
particular favorite? Is this your favorite as well? Or?
Well, no, this room isn't one of my favorites, but my favorite is the dining room. I'd love to show it to you.
Oh, I'd love to see it.
Well, let's go take a look at it.
Okay, great. Let's do that. Cheryl, this is just a beautiful room, and so this is your favorite, huh?
This is my favorite. The color's so vibrant, and
It's just so warm. It just
It is
has
very warm.
a very
the woodwork really contributes to that. We found this in terrible condition. It had years and years of paint on it, and we took all the paint off and stained the wood dark, and I think it really adds to the richness of it all.
and it's very Victorian to have the wood stain this dark color. Isn't that correct?
It is, and the dining rooms were very dark and dramatic.
In those times.
And we
Now,
tried to add to the drama of the dining room by this border. This is a reproduction wallpaper by Bradbury and Bradbury.
It's beautiful. And
It is.
this would be a very typical wallpaper border. You know, actually the depth and the colors in the wallpaper would be typical of that time.
Yes, and it does kind of extend the ceiling because the ceilings were all very high at that time. And kind of brings your eye upward.
Yeah. It's very effective. I like, even though I don't think I would ever put those colors together, it just works in this room for some reason.
It does. It's very dramatic. I love the cherry blossom theme and the corals. Very nice.
So, did you have to do a lot of research when you were working on this project?
Well, yes, I did. I read a lot about Victorian colors and patterns and decoration, and it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot.
I bet.
Yeah.
And so, had you ever done a Victorian restoration before?
No, I worked with the owners on the property on other projects, and they called me in on this one, and we all learned together. It was quite an adventure. It took us over a year to complete the project.
That's interesting. And the room itself is such a nice backdrop for Susan's lovely pieces in here, antique pieces. And I noticed the lovely chandelier. Is that an old piece?
This is an antique piece from the same time period in the 1880s.
It's really lovely. And the medallion was...
That is original. That was here.
That was, I know, very popular at that time to do Celia medallions.
Yes.
Now the trim around the windows, was that original to the house? And did you find it in that kind of condition, or did you have to
Well, we did have to
rehabilitate
piece
it?
some things together. Some things we had specially made, but we tried to keep the same flavor all the way through the house and using the same materials that were here before and the same patterns, and had to reproduce some of them.
Right. And we're standing in the back of the building, but it may have been the front of the building at one point. It's hard to know, but it looks like that gabled window on the upper story may not have been part of the original farmhouse. Is that correct, Cheryl?
I think that is the Victorian addition to the house. As you can see, the back of the house here is very plain, not like the Victorian detail that you see in the Victorian addition. I think that originally this may have been the entrance, the main entrance to the house, under the porch here, which leads into the family room, the room that Susan likes so much.
So but the porch also was an addition, correct?
Yes, I think the porch here is Sarah Winchester's addition. It may have had some type of porch, but I believe this and the balcony above is all part of the Victorian addition.
That lovely Gothic window as well?
Yes, that definitely wasn't part of the farmhouse, as well as those little French doors. That little sun porch there is part of Sarah's addition, as well as the porch.
Well, this and I noticed too that the corbels and the dental treatment there is similar to what we were seeing at the pool house.
Yes, what I tried to do is copy some of this to mirror the look of the house out there. We have the same corbels and exact same posts, the dental molding and the short overhangs, which is so Victorian.
Well, it's been a wonderful visit here, Cheryl. Thank you so much. We have
thank you.
learned a lot about an important landmark in Los Altos. Definitely this Winchester Merriman House is an important one to Los Altos. It's definitely one of the treasures. And thanks so much for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed learning a lot more about a very important historic home here in our town. And I hope you join us next time for the Los Altos History Show. Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks again.
Thank you.